morning and welcome everybody to the CSPC 2023 pre-conference sessions. We're the first up and we're very excited to be here with you this morning. So as we are kicking off the CSPC virtual sessions leading up to the in-person conference in November, we're really hoping that this panel in particular can spur some discussion and form some connections so that we can start to put the really important concepts that we're learning into practice. My name is Anthony Morgan, and I am the moderator for today's panel. I'm also one of the new co-hosts of The Nature of Things on CBC television. My mom is thrilled. I've been involved in science communication for more than half my life. I'm 37 now, and I started when I was 18 at the Ontario Science Centre. God bless that place. So I've been doing it for around 20 years. And I also serve on the advisory committee for the Misinformation Tackling Science Up First initiative, led by the Canadian Association of Science Centres. I want to start with a land acknowledgement this morning. So I am joining you from not technically my place of work, my home. I'm not in my home today. Unfortunately, there was my neighbor is cutting down a tree in our backyard, so there's a wood chipper in my backyard, and so I'm in a very new and comfortable environment, but I am still in Toronto, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We encourage you to use the chat box to share where you are joining us from in the traditional territory and the land that you're joining from. So before I introduce our panelists, I should probably give you guys some background. I want to extend a big thank you to the ISCD for supporting this panel, and thanks to the Canadian Association of Science Centres for their coordination. This panel is titled Information Overload, Exploring the Challenges People Face with Getting to the Truth in a Sea of Misinformation and Tools to Support Them. And so it's going to be a somewhat non-traditional panel. We're not going to have presentations or slides per se. We'd really like it to be more of a conversation. We've got some genuinely brilliant people who have worked on some very powerful and impactful reports, and we're just going to get to kind of pick their brains, unpack it, understand it, and hopefully you'll get the chance to do the same. And so the panel will be about 90 minutes in length and include lots of time for Q&A. So as we go through things, if questions start coming up for you, feel free to jot them down or even better yet, share them in the chat, and we'll take a subset of those and be able to ask our panelists those questions as well. So over the course of the discussion, you'll hear about, as I mentioned, some incredible reports over the last year or so. And so this panel's goal really is to help us better understand those findings and to get beyond just the academic practical, the academic part of it where we understand these things, but figure out how we can start to put these learnings into action to address the problems that we're really all here to think about, and namely misinformation. So each panelist is going to share results of a research study conducted by multiple different sectors. So there's government, there's academia, there's not-for-profit, and we'll be sharing links to some of those reports in the chat box as well. So if you want to follow up and really dig in on your own, then you're really encouraged to do that. And we'll focus on Q&A, and we'll focus in the Q&A on integrating ideas, exploring how to move beyond these reports, and potentially forming new collaborations across sectors. So, hopefully our chat section will become something like a matchmaker as well. And as I mentioned, there'll be time for you specifically to ask questions. So I really, really do encourage you to drop your questions in the chat. We really want this to be a panel where you get what you want out of this as much as we get to share some really important ideas. So without much further ado, I'll introduce our panelists, and I'll begin with Dr. Jagris Hodson. Dr. Hodson is the Canada Research Chair in Digital Communication for the Public Interest at Royal Roads University. Her research examines the ways that misinformation can be mitigated through digital communication efforts, and particularly those targeted at the research community. Dr. Nicholas Diamond is a senior behavioral scientist in the Government of Canada's Impact and Innovation Unit. The leading team's research on the impacts of trust. He is leading the team's research on the impacts of trust, trustworthiness, and misinformation across multiple policy domains. So COVID-19, climate change, immigration, digital technology, you name it. And finally, our final panelist for today is Magda Baima, and she is the director of Science Up First, an initiative very close to my own heart, and one that is it's an initiative of the Canadian Association of Science Centers. She leads a team of exceptional content creators, and I know that firsthand, and science communicators that debunk science information on social media platforms. Science Up First provides Canadians with relevant and accessible science-backed content to help make informed decisions. So welcome to all of you, and thank you all so much for being here this morning. Can't wait to get started. And I think we'll start with you this morning, Jagris. Your research report was called Fault Lines, the expert panel on the socioeconomic impacts of science and health. And so I guess I want to start by just kind of asking in broad strokes, what are the questions that you were hoping to address with this research?
Thanks, Anthony. Yes, so this was an initiative put together by the Council of Canadian Academies, and I was one of quite a large expert panel. What we wanted to do is look at the ways that misinformation is really threatening the individual and collective well-being of Canadians. And so in particular, we were interested in the socioeconomic impacts of particularly science and health misinformation, which I know everybody on the panel is really concerned with today. And then how might we disrupt those that science and health information? What practices are best to disrupt the misinformation when it occurs, right? We see impacts like polarization, diminished trust, inaction on things like climate change, lower compliance with public health, and people can die or get very ill when they're exposed to misinformation, and those all have a cost. And we quantified those costs using various models and case studies to sort of get at, what is this costing Canadians?
So you're really trying to understand, all right, we know that misinformation, we all talk a lot about misinformation and disinformation, and I think there's this public sense that it really is a problem, but you were really trying to ground that in some empiricism and figure out, is this really the case? And I'm excited to dive into that, but I think it's probably important to start with some definitions so that we're all talking about the same kinds of things, because I think for many people across different industries attending a panel or a discussion like this, they probably have some different ideas about what misinformation means exactly. So can you start by just sharing your definition of misinformation?
Absolutely, Anthony. And I know that my co-panelists will probably agree with me, and many Canadians too. But it is worth noting that the popular ideas of misinformation is sometimes like stuff I don't believe in. But really, misinformation is false or misleading information that can be shared either deliberately or inadvertently. Now, when it's shared inadvertently, it's just simple misinformation, but it becomes disinformation when it is shared deliberately. And it could even be something called, information operations when it is shared by other geopolitical actors that are looking to sow division. So you can sort of scale up, but misinformation is the broad umbrella term for any false or misleading information, regardless of why it is shared.
Great. So when we talk about misinformation, your goal again was to try to quantify this and ground this in real terms. There are any number of domains you could have explored. In this report, you decided you were going to focus specifically on COVID-19.
That's right, Anthony. So the reason why we chose COVID-19 is not because we were trying to be controversial, but because it was, sort of a time-bound and very specific case that we could quantify. Now, you and I in the past have talked about, for example, climate change and how might we quantify that? And that is just too big and nuanced to really be able to quantify that. In COVID-19, we can take abacus poll data, which we did on how many people were vaccine hesitant or thought that maybe COVID was a hoax. And then we can match that against the number of deaths, the number of hospitalization, the number of COVID cases that were reported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Information. And so we ran a couple of models. We ran a baseline model, which is where we, assumed that everything that happened, happens in the baseline model, and we just ran that. And then we took a model that took into account the abacus data, which told us that 7% of the population declared themselves vaccine reluctant, right? And there was 34% people that maybe thought COVID was exaggerated. And we took those numbers and we put them into a bucket, and we said, well, all things being equal, if these people had been influenced by misinformation, how would that impact the hospitalizations, deaths, et cetera? And these were conservative estimates because the hospitalizations and other impacts of COVID-19 often went unreported. So we were going with only the reported data. But the model showed that we could have had up to 198,000 fewer COVID cases, 13,000 fewer hospitalizations, about 3,500 fewer people in the ICU, 2,800 fewer deaths, and that would add up to roughly $299 million saved in hospital costs if the people who had been influenced by misinformation to be vaccine hesitant or thought COVID was a hoax, if they had gone and gotten vaccinated when the vaccine was available. And this is just one case. And of course, we know that misinformation didn't stop at COVID, but it really gave us a good way to sort of understand one aspect of misinformation and one small impact to the Canadian economy.
That's really incredible. I mean, 200,000 fewer COVID cases potentially is not insignificant. You were looking at this. This was nationwide data you were looking at. Or was it broken down province by province as well?
No, we didn't break it down province by province. So it was nationwide data, and it was based on data from many different sources. So like as I mentioned, we used the abacus survey to really judge what proportion of the population overall was vaccine hesitant. We didn't have that right for each province, so we couldn't break it up that granularly. But our COVID cases were compiled by Radio Canada. Risk of hospitalization was from the Government of Canada Public Health. ICU hospitalizations were the Canadian Institute for Health Information, right? So we got all of these at the national scale from many different reputable sources to calculate the model.
Okay, and so 200,000 additional or 200,000 fewer potential infections. That was the conservative estimate. What was the more extreme end of the estimates?
Well, like I said, we couldn't go there because that would have been based on data that was gone unreported, right? So it was conservative estimates because there were certain hospitalizations were not reported, and especially those cases. Right. So if I had a case at home, I got better on my own, it wasn't necessarily reported, especially the farther along we got in the COVID pandemic, pardon me. And our data was collected also between March and November of 2021. So with that cutoff in November of 2021, we still missed a bunch of cases, and we would have missed deaths and those sorts of things. So because of that, the model was necessarily, it was not all encompassing because there's just data we didn't have.
If there are key points that you would say that were the most surprising takeaways for you, what would you say that might be?
Well, I mean, I think that everybody is surprised to learn that, we are all susceptible, right? Nobody is immune to misinformation. And that includes, academics like us or, science communicators, right? And I think the other things that were really surprising was the fact that even though, it's a small portion of the population who were vaccine hesitant, that, those numbers of cases and the amount that we could have saved in hospital costs, when you then extrapolate that out to people who are receiving misinformation on other things and maybe not acting on, I also study cancer misinformation, for example. And if people are hesitant to go get conventional cancer therapies like chemotherapy, how much could we save there, right? So that number on the one issue of COVID really shows us that, especially with science and health misinformation, how much there is at stake.
When you think about if you're collecting data about people who are self-reported vaccine hesitant, I imagine that might include, I mean, that'll certainly include people who know that they're vaccine hesitant, who know that they're nervous about it. Did you have any concerns about people sort of with the accuracy of their self-reporting, like people who are maybe more vaccine hesitant, but they wouldn't say they are? They're just saying, I'm a rational person. I'm not vaccine hesitant. I just don't think they're, you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
You're right, Anthony. Yeah, self-reporting data always has that issue to it. But luckily, we have the fact that many people who are vaccine hesitant these days are kind of proud to be. It is no longer really, socially unacceptable to be vaccine hesitant. So there's that. But also, yes, I mean, I think you've highlighted another limitation of the model and a reason why this estimate is still conservative. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I have to be mindful of time. I've been tasked with doing that. And so I'm going to jump now to the next report. For anybody who is interested, again, that report is called it's by the Canadian Council of Academies, and it's called Fault Lines, the Expert Panel on the Socioeconomic Impacts of Science and Health. And that should be available in the chat. Thank you so much, Jagris.
Thank you.
I think I will jump now to Nick. And the report that you worked on was by the OECD. It was a 2022 report called Misinformation and Disinformation, an international effort at using behavioral science to tackle the spread of misinformation. So I think we get a sense broadly what your aims were, but in your own words, I'd love to hear what the kind of key questions you were hoping to answer were.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So we had a number of questions we wanted to answer. First, just to set some context, this was an international collaboration, as you mentioned in the title, with the OECD and the government of France. And this was an online experiment, but it was situated in a huge multi-year program of research on COVID-19 and Canadians' related beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and a big longitudinal study called Cosmo Canada, the COVID-19 snapshot monitoring study. So in this particular experiment, in this particular report, our main questions were, number one, what drives people to believe misinformation in the first place? What individual and system level factors sort of lead people to find mis and disinformation compelling? A second related question was then, what drives people to want to amplify or share misinformation in their social network? Which is actually quite a tricky question and is different from the question of what drives someone to believe it. We know that sharing on social media in particular can have a massive effect on exposure and proliferation of misinformation in the aggregate. When you add up each person's sort of sharing or retweets, what you get is a net effect of like exponential just flooding of mis and disinformation. And then lastly, our final question was, what can we do about this? Can we look to the academic and behavioral science literature? And are there any evidence-informed, light touch behavioral interventions that we could test to see if we could reduce the proliferation of misinformation online without actually compromising anybody's autonomy?
So I want to, all three of those are really valuable. I want to unpack the first one. We'll go one at a time. So you mentioned sort of this idea that attention is a really important factor, and you talked about the idea that people are discerning in the true headlines they talk about versus the false headlines. How were you, when you're trying to figure out, when you're trying to quantify, when you're trying to measure the people's willingness to share true and false information, where did you see the differences there?
Yeah, great question. So we adapted our methodological approach from the academic literature. There was one study in particular that was published in the journal Nature. It was a very big deal in 2021, trying to understand why people share misinformation and what to do about it. We sort of built on that. So to answer your question, we would source verifiably true and false COVID-related headlines. These are headlines that actually circulated on social media. We adapted the headlines from the academic literature. In this online experiment, and in many survey waves since then, we would present research participants with these true and false headlines, just the same way that you would see them on Facebook or on Twitter. And for each one, we can ask, how accurate do you think this headline is? We can also ask separately, either in the same set of people or in a different set of people, how likely would you be to share this in your social network? So it is self-report sharing intentions, not real shares, although there is evidence that people's self-reported sharing intentions map quite well to what they actually do on social media. And then to concretely answer your question about how these are related, beliefs and sharing intentions, they actually sort of break apart in a really critical way that set the stage for our intervention. And the way they break apart is this. On average, people are quite good at discerning true from false headlines in terms of their accuracy perceptions, in terms of their beliefs. So you can call that truth discernment. Like, how accurate do you think true headlines are? How accurate do you think false headlines are? And most people have this huge gap where they find true headlines a lot more true than false headlines, which is good, because society would crumble if that wasn't true. But the really interesting thing is that people's sharing discernment, that is their intentions to share true headlines versus false headlines, that gap is way smaller. So put in even simpler terms, people are willing to share news on social media, even if they're skeptical about its truth value. And then the question becomes why? What is it about social media?
Well, I mean, you've asked my next question. I would really love to know what are your sort of intuitions about that, or did the data have anything to say about that?
Yeah, well, the story sort of from our research and the ever-growing academic research on this is that it's not simply the case that people just intentionally want to spread untruths and want to create vaccine hesitancy. There's not a ton of intentional disinformation actors among the normal Canadian public, as Jagris highlighted. But the evidence suggests that the social media context sort of sets the stage to draw people's attention away from how accurate or reliable information is and towards other factors like social signaling, like surprise, like emotion and outrage. There's a sort of a simple, obvious fact, but it's worth considering, which is that true things are not surprising or exciting. You know, if I tell you like, you know, medicine can help cure diseases, you're not going to go, wow, like retweet. My network has to hear this. But if you hear, oh, maybe a vaccine causes some problem, people sometimes might say, I actually don't know if this is true, but I want to get a bunch of likes or reactions, or just, you know, I have an impulse to share this. It's surprising. Wow. And it's sort of this inflammatory space. So it's really all about attention, what people pay attention to when they're online making sharing decisions.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me because I mean, a lot of my own research around the influence of status seems to suggest that people really like it's a stat. I mean, social media is a big status game. And so I guess it makes sense that people might want to share content because they get all the internet thumbs uppies. They get they build their status within their networks. Is there any evidence that people might be sharing it as an attempt to kind of understand? So you use the example that people see in something, it's surprising. They're like, I'm not sure if this is true. Might they reshare it to say, does anyone know if this is true? Is it fact checking, or is it just kind of something else?
Absolutely. I don't want to make the case that all sharing of misinformation is sort of nefarious. I think there are lots of good reasons that people would share information that they're skeptical about. They might literally share it and say, hey, does anyone know anything about this? Can we talk about this? That would be sort of a healthy example of unintentional misinformation sharing. But nonetheless, the key fact of that decoupling between our perceptions of reality and what we're willing to amplify on huge digital networks opens the door to potential interventions that don't get in the way of people's, you know, own right to choose what they want to believe and what they want to share, but that open the door to help people bring their sharing decisions in line with their own perceptions of the truth. And that's sort of what gave rise to our experiment.
And I know there are a number of different techniques and strategies that you have conclusions you've come to about what actually works as a tool for reducing the likelihood that we share what we know to be false versus we know this to be true, and we'll be more likely to share the true things. But I do have to try to be mindful of time as well. So I'm going to come back to that. But you, in your report, trust as a prism through which everything is filtered is this really kind of consistently important idea. The idea that people will, well, you wouldn't trust anything that you doesn't come from a source that isn't trusted. So what did your report have to say about the importance of trust as a mechanism for deciding what's misinformation and what's not, and how we can change the perceptions of trust?
Yeah, great question. So I'll say first, super quick, in case we run out of time, the thing that helps mitigate sharing of false news is a brief digital literacy prompt that takes only like 30 seconds or a minute before people see COVID-related news headlines. And that reduces the sharing intentions for false news without affecting sharing intentions for true news. But coming back to your question, our big question about why people come to believe and share misinformation in the first place, we did find that trust is essential. It's really all about trust. And one of our key findings that we've now replicated many times is that if you ask people how much they trust or how much they use a whole bunch of sources, government, scientists, social media, friends, family, healthcare workers, you can reliably, using fancy quantitative tools, break down the population into 3 subtypes of information trusters. And we see the same thing over and over again. And you have folks who trust institutional sources disproportionately, like government, scientists, healthcare workers. You have folks who are disproportionately trusting of social media and social informal sources, and less so government and scientists. And then you have folks who say they trust nobody, and who tend to score higher on measures of conspiratorial thinking using validated psychometric scales. And basically, these 3 segments of trust have super different perceptions of misinformation, super different beliefs, super different sharing intentions. The institution trusting folks have the lowest misinformation belief and lowest misinformation sharing intentions. But to close it off, the nice key takeaway is that the intervention we tested using digital media literacy to reduce sharing of false news, that worked equally well across all groups. So it may be a generalizable approach to reducing the sharing of misinformation.
That's fascinating. I have to know the sort of relative proportion of each of those 3 groups in our society. I mean, one would hope that the proportion of people who trusted in governments and healthcare and scientists would be the largest, but that, I mean, my guess is that that's not the case. Which one was the lion's share?
In this particular study, that group was the largest, but only marginally. Basically, whenever we do this, it's roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts, Nick. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to bring you back on in a moment, but I think we're going to jump on to our third panelist, Magda. And so Magda, your report was put together by the Canadian Association of Science Centers. It's called Information Overload Report. What we can do. So a quick summary of what we can do. Aim to support science communicators. Hang on, I think I'm reading the wrong title. So this is called Information Overload, Exploring the Challenges People Face Navigating a Sea of Misinformation. And I think this is a problem that each of us is very familiar with in our own lives, with our family and friends and with ourselves. We have more access to information than we have ever had, libraries and libraries at our fingertips. And it seems like an increasingly daunting problem to figure out, how do we know what we should trust? How do we know what we should not? And so, coming off of this idea of trust that Nick spoke about, I guess I'll ask you what some of the key questions that you were hoping to explore with this research were.
Yeah, so information overload, it's everywhere. There's so much that we're getting bombarded with every single day, especially on social media platforms. I'm going to take it a step back, Anthony, just to give a little bit of context, because it'll kind of help with the findings that we had. So the audience that we were trying to understand better with this report, because this report initially was done for Science at First as we were moving into addressing misinformation outside of COVID. We wanted to really understand what our audience needed from Science at First as a trusted source. And what we actually found was this incredible depth of information about how people navigate their way through the information overload right now. The individuals that we actually polled were a cross-section, a national cross-section, but they were science curious, kind of in that movable middle, because as Science at First, we have recognized that our best bet is to reach that movable middle with really good, solid science-backed information that is accessible and relevant to them. Provide them that information, those tools, so that they can take this good information into their communities. And then hopefully with this information, they're able to reach those deniers, those vaccine hesitant individuals, because those individuals are much more receptive to information coming from their trusted community sources than likely to be looking to Science Up First for information. So it's kind of our theory is that by providing people that are science curious with really relevant, accessible information, we arm them with the ability to be those science communicators in their communities.
Right. So you're facilitating, I mean, you're just kind of like Johnny Appleseed, building science communicators across the country. And it seems like that was one of the key findings for your report, right? That idea that trust is key.
Yes, absolutely. So going back to the findings that we had, and really excited about what Nick is saying, because it is very consistent. What we found from the report was that individuals are looking for trusted sources of communication. They are much more engaged in finding the trusted sources, and kind of that information seeking journey it's not linear. It's also not cyclical. It really is quite random, but they do look for various different sources. And the other thing that we found around trust, which was really interesting and surprising, was that not only are audiences looking for trusted sources of information, but they expect to be trusted by these sources that are giving them the information. And they want us as science communicators to trust the audience to make the right decisions, to make their own decisions using the information that we give them. So it really is kind of a two-way street. They trust us to provide really good science-backed information, and we need to stop telling people what to do, essentially, and let them make their own decisions.
That's really fascinating. I mean, I think it's something that many science communicators would struggle with at times, I guess, just because, you know, many of us are literally experts in these fields. And so the reason we operate in these fields is to help us figure out how to make better and wiser decisions. But what your report found was that this kind of eat your peas science approach is not one that's very effective. People tend not to respond to it well.
No.
But it's not the only thing that your report found. You also found evidence that there are these different kind of categories of the science that's relevant to people when they're looking for it. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so this was really interesting for us. So we found that individuals categorize information into 3 different buckets. And each of these buckets of information is really linked to emotional states, which then drive action. So the first bucket that we recognize is this bucket of information that they don't understand and that it isn't useful for them. This bucket of information really caused individuals to feel very negative, frustrated, and willing to just shove it aside and just not even worry about that information. The second bucket was kind of that neutral bucket of information. This is information that they understand, but it's not useful. It's not answering a question. It's not really addressing anything that's relevant to the audiences. So this information makes people feel very smart, pretty good about themselves, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they feel empowered to do anything with it because it's not relevant to them at that specific time. Then there's the third bucket of information, which is the information that people understand and that it is also relevant to them and useful. And this is the information that makes individuals feel empowered, energetic, really positive. This is the piece of information that will make individuals go and get their vaccines, which will make individuals start talking in their communities and taking action. So this is kind of that holy grail for where we as science communicators should really look to aim when we're creating content.
Is that sort of intersection of timely, personal, relevant?
Yes, relevant.
So this, for me, raises a bunch of different questions. I mean, so we've got these 3 categories. The first category is this kind of, what is the scattering amplitude of 2 protons colliding together? That's the kind of information that people, they don't understand, and they're like, not important, not timely, not relevant to myself. Then there's, that category where people are, I found out recently for an episode of the show, there's this molecule called SCOBA3 that you can use to reduce hair loss. And so maybe for a subset of our audience, that's very important. And so they would want to follow up. But for most people, okay, that's kind of neat and not really relevant. When we talk about timeliness, in your report, when you were looking at it, how are you? I imagine that there'd be some subset who have a full head of hair right now. And so they're not really concerned with what SCOBA3 is or how that molecule works to regrow hair. But maybe 5 years down the line, or maybe a month down the line, or sometime, it's not relevant to them right now, but they know it's likely to become relevant at some point. Did the report look at those kinds of information at all, or did you distinguish between those kinds of information?
We didn't. We were looking at kind of a snapshot in a certain period of time, just because the way that we use it as science communicators, we have a certain moment with individuals. So we really want to grab those individuals, especially if we're building a reputation as a trusted source. So we continue to reach individuals with accessible, relevant information. And so we build that brand as a trusted source in their mind. So when they do have the unfortunate, future hair loss, they know where to come to get better information.
This makes a lot of sense to me. So you build this brand, and so that maybe they're not interested in the content that they've read right then, but they know when I have a question about how to treat my grandmother's cough, or they have a question about whether or not this food is safe, they know, oh, you're the source that we should come to.
Yeah. You want to make sure that you're reaching your audience with relevant content more often than not, so that you build that connection, that relationship with them, and then they'll come back to you when they have other questions, because they know that you've answered their questions in the past with really good, solid information.
And in your report, you have almost something like a recipe for people who are creating content that they can use to become those kinds of trusted sources. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we also did was we looked at the national perception on science, like how do people view science? And as we all know, that COVID has changed people's perceptions on science. However, the good news is that people still trust science. They do not trust information presented as science in kind of that fake way, but they do trust science. So the other thing that we found about our audience when we were looking at this perception of science was, what are they looking to get from a trusted source? And they're really looking to regain their joy of learning about science, looking for a community where they can learn, engage, and really trust. And so out of all of our findings, we came up with 7 really like checkpoints of this is what you need to do to be a trusted source. So you have to provide facts, not opinions. Like, this is all science-backed. You have to be evidence-based, confident, clear, and data-driven language. And when we say clear, it's accessible as well. So you don't want to use $1 million words when you can use a word that people really understand. You want to present experts that are relevant, not just stick somebody in a lab coat and hope that people are trusting of that, because again, that's information presented as science, not actual science. And you want to be transparent, authentic, with no hidden agenda. That, of course, means that you're unbiased and that you have a proven track record. So again, it's building that relationship. One of the things as an initiative of CASC, Science at First has this incredible connection with really trusted science communicators nationally. These are our science centers. So it really made me incredibly happy to see all of these points and to know that we have this network across Canada that is already the trusted sources for Canadians.
Well, I think that seems like a great place to leave this portion of the panel. I really appreciate you sharing those thoughts, Magda. And for anybody who is interested or curious about the recipe, I should confirm with you, they can find that recipe in your report as well?
Yes, and I'm sure that the link to the full report's in the chat already.
Wonderful. So I guess at this point, I'll welcome all 3 of our panelists back to the main screen. The goal for this panel really has been at its inception to find ways to integrate the remarkably useful frameworks and reports and information that you have all collated into one overarching framework that we can use to, we've got lots of different kinds of organizations present with us today, from government to academia to not-for-profits and on the ground science communicators. We want to figure out how we can combine the frameworks that you have each devised for thinking about these problems into something that they can actually use, and just start that process of integration and breaking down these kinds of silos. And so for that reason, I really want to invite each of you to ask one another questions, because I'm sure that, as you got to listen to one another, I'm sure there were questions and thoughts that arose for you. And so, yeah, I guess I'll open the floor to the three of you to do just that. And if not, I have some questions as well. But I don't know if, is there anything that came up for the three of you while you were listening to one another get to chat about this that you, yep. Okay, Jagras, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And I think this question could apply to both Nicholas and Magda's work. So I invite you both to consider it. I'm really struck by the issue of who we trust and why, and our social networks, and especially, Nicholas, in your report, right? The people who only trust social media or don't trust anything. And I recognize that, some of the tips in both your report, Nicholas, and your report, Magda, might be stymied by these people who don't trust anything or who only trust social media. And so I'm wondering, based on both your work, is there any way to reach those people, or do we just have to let them go and reach everybody else, the other 2/3, say, or the other third in some cases?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in first. The answer is yes. I think there are ways to reach these people, and I think we have to be committed to that. I've heard attitudes out there that, like, you got to find the audience that's listening to you and just focus on them, and everyone else is a lost cause anyway. I personally don't think that's the way forward. But to be concrete, there are specific strategies that I think governments, institutions, science as an institution can use to proactively earn trust. Because after all, trust has to be earned. You can't just tell someone to trust you. You have to give them a reason to trust you. And as Magda said, this needs to be done sort of in advance to cultivate this reputation with your audience. So just very briefly, we did another experiment in collaboration with researchers at Harvard Business School who have worked a lot on the idea of operational transparency as a way to earn trust. And operational transparency just means, for any organization or business, you take a sort of glass walls approach to what you're doing, to processes as they're unfolding. You let people see what's happening, basically, rather than keeping them in the dark and then popping out at the end and saying, hey, do this or do that. So concretely, we did an experiment with almost 2,000 unvaccinated Canadians. COVID unvaccinated, and this was in the middle of the pandemic. So it was quite a rare and valuable research sample. And we tested the government of Canada's actual status quo Twitter messaging campaign at the time to boost vaccines against new operationally transparent Twitter messaging campaigns that we came up with. And we found that even among the unvaccinated, that more transparent messaging campaigns boosted intentions to get vaccinated by 8 to 9%, which maybe feels small, but statistically it was very robust. And if that were to scale up to the country as a whole, now if is the key word, but if it were to generalize, we know from your report, Jagras, that 8 to 9% greater vaccine uptake among the vaccine skeptical, we're talking about potentially hundreds of lives saved and like $20 to $30 million in hospital costs saved, if my quick math is right. So that's one concrete thing I would want to share: transparency to earn trust.
Yeah, and I think this is, I feel, Nicholas, like your report is providing a really big validation to the findings that we've had as well. And again, it's that transparency is one of the things that people look for when they're developing trusted sources. Speaking to your question though, Jagras, I feel that we create content for our audience, and we know that our audience is science curious. They have demographic kind of information. We understand who our audience is. However, as I mentioned, like the idea, we're not throwing away the hesitant audience, because it's just a matter of trying to find different ways to get to that audience. So do you provide the science curious individuals with the right tools, the right information, so that they can then become like that Johnny Appleseed that we are, you know, that other communicator in the community that is trusted, and the message would land much better from a trusted source than it would from Science at First, because you know there's perceptions from hesitant individuals when they come to a source like us. So I feel that through multiple avenues, through different communicators using good science-backed information, we definitely have a very good chance of reaching individuals.
I have a question if our panelists, if you guys don't mind. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that this idea of the eat your piece science, and that you know, your report, Magda, really strongly suggests that people don't want to be told what to do per se. They want to be provided information, they want to be informed, but then they'd like to have the freedom to make their own decisions. And you know, that, I mean, what I think would concern many people about that is the idea that, well, isn't that describing something like vaccine hesitant or vaccine resistant people? They're deciding not to. Maybe they have good reasons for doing it, maybe they don't, but in their own minds, they certainly have good reasons for not doing it. And you know, Jagris's report shows us that those impacts, if they're allowed to make the wrong decision, they can be quite significant. How do we reconcile that that reality that people want their freedom to make their decisions, but that means that sometimes they'll make decisions that aren't necessarily in line with the best available science? This is more just a general question to the panel. How do you imagine we ought to address that problem?
Can I just jump in? I'm sure everybody's got a lot of really great ideas as well. I think that I wonder, and if it's a question, how many of these people that were deniers actually had accessible information to make their decision on? So I think if we provide individuals, we have to trust that our audience, if they're looking for good scientific information, also are able to make the decisions on their own. We want them to be able to take this information, to trust the science, and to move forward and make the right, the informed decision, because it may not be the right decision. So I think it's just the ability to have the information to make the right decision. I don't know, Jagris or Nicholas, if you guys had those questions, like how did you make your decisions if you decided against vaccines?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in for a bit here, Magda, thank you, because you know, we didn't specifically ask those questions, but we did a very extended literature review to see what, you know, the academic literature was saying on the topic. And really, and I think that you know, you'll both agree that yes, it's important to have accessible information, but information alone, right, because of that institutional trust piece, is not enough. And we really need to lean in, you know, policymakers, governments at all levels, and even, you know, corporations can contribute to this, right? And academics can certainly contribute. We need to find ways to increase that institutional trust back up, because the right information coming from the wrong source isn't going to land. And even if we do all those great things like the transparency and everything else, that's good once, you know, we know that people are trusting us or trusting, you know, somebody in their community who can deliver that message. But it is super important to figure out this issue of you know, trust, which seems to still be, unfortunately, trending in the wrong direction in Canada and the US. And so, you know, taking steps to look at that more fulsomely, I think, will go a long way.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I have two quick thoughts. So first is just echoing what Magda and Jagris have both said already. My previous answer, like you have to give people a reason to trust and act on information. You can't, the eat your peas approach, saying trust science. That's something that a lot of us like to say, trust science. but why? If you're someone who doesn't trust science, that's not a compelling argument. You need to bring people into the process. And I think what makes science amazing to me as a huge nerd is like, it's the best tool we have to figure out the truth and how to solve problems. Flawed as it is, it's the best we have available. So we need to recognize we're in a competition for attention, trust with all kinds of different argument makers out there. And I think we need to let people see that, you know, science is not something that like you should believe. It's literally, it's for us. It's, you know, science is almost always publicly funded, and it's the best tool we have to like improve the quality of our lives and to figure out not every problem, but when it comes to things like vaccines, like, yes, absolutely. So I think we need to bring people in.
I wonder sort of anecdotally, I mean, my experience anecdotally has been that it's very rare to find people who will say, I don't trust science. What they'll say is something like, I don't trust your science, or I don't trust your scientist. I trust my scientist just fine. I was curious about whether or not that intuition that I have is borne out in any of the data that you collected. So for instance, Jagris, when you're collecting data from the vaccine hesitant, how granular do you get with your kinds of assessments? Do you know whether people don't trust specific kinds of scientists, or Nick, you might have some intuitions about that. I mean, you have this large group of people who say that they trust institutions, but maybe they trust scientists who are like the minority of scientists who say that climate change is not a problem, but they say, I still trust scientists. What are you seeing in the data?
So in the CCA report, we didn't go granular on that data. All we had was access to data, which told us the percentage of people who were vaccine hesitant. But on another project that I'm involved with, we actually talked to health communicators, right, about the issue of antisocial online behavior. And one of the things they told us was that they were shocked when other health communicators would come out and say something that wasn't evidence-based. So part of the problem in that case is that people do have other science to draw from, right? There is a my science versus your science. And I think that, you know, part of that could be that maybe some of these health communicators might be talking slightly outside their field, right? Maybe they're not an expert in epidemiology, they're an expert in something else, but they are opining on epidemiology, and people don't always recognize the difference. But I think, you know, maybe process and procedures around figuring some of those things out might help people to not feel like, you know, there's my science versus your science. Although I'm sure, you know, Magda can speak to that too, because of the information overload part of the issue.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we're grappling with as well. Is we saw in the report, people said COVID affected my perception of science because, you know, science is telling me to do this, and then science is telling me, okay, no, now it's this. And as scientists, you can say this is science at work because we're making changes, we're actually making improvements, and we're sharing these improvements. But for the general public, it was quite confusing. So one of the things, and I think it speaks to something that you had talked about, Nick, as well. One of the things that we're trying to do at Science at First is not only address topics of misinformation, but also help individuals understand scientific process and how things work, and just kind of that science literacy, beefing that up as a whole, so that when things change quickly, you don't look at it as a negative thing. Look, science failed us. What you see is the science is working, and we're sharing the incremental changes and the research. It's supporting us getting better. So it's we don't have a solution to it just yet, but we are working to see how we can connect with the general public and educate on the processes for science.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I think, yeah, some added literacy or awareness about the process of science can help people differentiate like the reliable science from some of the bunk science that unfortunately does proliferate. I don't have a great solution, but I'll share one insight about this that I find really interesting from our data. And it's that perceptions of what is trustworthy or untrustworthy science trust in general, beliefs in general. These are highly social phenomena. And we need to realize that in the country of Canada and the world, but especially online, people are living in very different bubbles. We are all in bubbles. We cannot escape this. But, we've measured beliefs in claims like, ivermectin cures COVID better than vaccines. We've measured people's belief in the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine and other scientific sounding things that came out during the pandemic. They seem like science to people. The challenge is that the people who believe these claims, like vaccines cause infertility, ivermectin is the best thing you can do, the more that they believe it, the more they overestimate how many other believe it too. And so there's a false perception of consensus that can happen sometimes because of these echo chamber and bubble effects, where people are just awash in information saying like, hey, vaccines are bad. And everyone they're seeing online because of the bubble they're in is saying like, yeah, vaccines are bad. Like we all know what the good science is. And so I think we need to find a way to pierce through this sort of social fractionation of people, and give everyone a reason through transparency, through bringing people into the process of science to sort of see for themselves what is more or less trustworthy.
Nick, do you feel that building that community for that discussion, for that, the joy of, learning science again, kind of, like, is that one of the keys to, is that one of the solutions, right? Like if there's communities of deniers and vaccine hesitancy that are really within themselves spinning this information, sharing this information, do we not give individuals those community spaces where they can share trusted sources of information? And like the science centers, right? They're trusted, they're local, they understand their audience feels at home and safe to speak and enjoy science in those centers. Like I think the key is to give people those places to be part of that community.
100%. I agree. I think we need more of it, even more science centers.
I'll jump in there because I have to wonder about, somewhat selfishly, personally, I study the role of identity in the spread of misinformation and identity to me, perhaps because of that experience, seems inextricably linked to a lot of what we're talking about, right? That these kinds of bubbles that we exist within are defined by our identities. Nick, your work looks at this 1/3 of the population that is, they don't trust anyone. Is that an identity on its own? Are they part of the unreachable proportion of the population that we're not going to focus on immediately, and maybe some of the stuff that Magda's working on can help give people tools to reach them? Are they unreachable? To what degree is identity a construct that we should be focusing on if we're trying to address the spread of misinformation? I've stumped you.
I'll jump in mostly to just say I agree. I think identity is a huge thing we need to pay attention to. A lot of misinformation research, and I'm guilty of this too, sort of talks about people like we're all a bunch of philosophers walking around the world and being like, is that true? No. Is that true? Yes. When in fact, we see things through social lenses, through trust lenses, and through identity lenses. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just being a person. My feelings about all kinds of scientific matters are tied up with my identity as someone who considers themselves a scientist. And I do think that a lot of science rejection or lack of trust, or that 1/3 non-trusting group that I mentioned, I think there probably is an identity component, and there are parts of it that are valid. I think we need to see this from a place of empathy, knowing that we are all in bubbles, we all have identity filters, and there are feelings like not being a sheep, not blindly trusting institutions and environments. That's not an inherent, that's a reasonable feeling. I don't think anybody should blindly trust anything. They should trust because they have a good reason to trust. So yeah, I think it's true, and we need to recognize that and maybe come from a place of empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. And empathy is key. I know that's something our team really focuses on, the no judgment, just information in an accessible way. So again, it's information for us at Science at First, because we release our information mainly on social media platforms, but also in person. The information that we create is very intentionally highly graphic. It's at a grade 6 reading level. It is created both in English and French, which means that it's not translated between the two, but it's authentically created. It's also translated into various South Asian languages to make it accessible for people, so that people don't have to stay within that identity of, I'm not a PhD, so I don't get the science, right? So it's that accessibility of the information. I think that is really key.
I could ask the three of you questions for the rest of probably this year, but I want to open up the floor to our wonderful audience. They've been populating our chat with questions as well. Shortly before we do that, though, I'm gonna ask if before we start, can we just take a moment to answer the CSE? It's an optional demographic poll on the sector, the region, career stage that you're at, and the goal is to better understand you as an audience, so that we can make sure that we're putting together panels that are what you're looking for and are what are useful for you. So I guess I'll give you, I'm not sure how long we've budgeted for, I guess it's about 5 minutes. We'll give you 5 minutes to do that. And in that meantime, I really would love to ask our panelists another question, because you're fascinating people to me. So Jagris, I'd be curious about the degree to which that you think that the populations, in particular the vaccine hesitant, the vaccine resistant, the degree to which you think your intuition is that they are likely to identify as people who like science, or do they believe in science? Do they self-identify as people who are scientifically literate or scientifically thinking, or would your guess be that they'd fall into that sort of category of people who are they don't trust anyone, and which is in some ways an impulse we do really want to foster, right? We want to foster critical thinking. There's some places that they might go wrong. What's your intuition about that vaccine hesitant group? How can we characterize them from an identity standpoint?
That's a great question, Anthony. And I think that we have to decouple this idea of trust from this decoupling of, do I believe in science, right? Because, as you noted rightly, a couple questions ago, this idea of my science versus somebody else's science is very prevalent among that community and other communities who are swimming in misinformation. And so I think that this community, anecdotally characterizes themselves as critical thinkers. They're very critical, right? Conspiracy, is very critical in some ways. And I think that maybe they just don't have those key digital literacy skills, right? That Nicholas's study really pointed to in understanding what critical literacy really means in a digital realm. It's not just being critical of everything, right? It is investigating sources and understanding maybe more, as Magda and Nicholas both said about this process of science, which I think is maybe a little bit lacking. So I think they do believe that they are more critical, and that people who are following the institutional science are acting less critically. And I think that's a nut that is going to be a bit tough to crack, but is much needed, because if they think that, say, Canadian science centers are the institutional tools of the government, right, versus maybe their favorite podcaster who might be a conspiracy theorist, and that is more scientific, then that's a problem, and that's a problem we really need to, I think, understand a little bit better. But it's hard, right? Because conspiracy theorists, generally speaking, not 100% of the time, but generally speaking, they're not the ones signing up for academic studies. So it can be really hard to talk to them, right? Because they don't trust us.
Right. So I mentioned that we are going to open up the, thank you for that, Jagris, by the way. I mentioned that we're going to open up the panel now to questions from the audience. There are a number of ways you can participate in that. So I already see a number of questions that you've written in the chat. I believe you're also able to put up your hand, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to see the hands that are up, but if you do have a question that you'd like to ask live, we're happy to have those. So go ahead and your hand up, and we'll take some of those questions. But for now, we'll start with a question from Sabrina Kinsella. She asks, have any of the panelists looked specifically at relevant perceptions, behaviors, and approaches around science, health information among Indigenous populations, given the historical factors that have contributed to mistrust of the government medical research? There's no shortage of examples of the Canadian government, unfortunately, mistreating our Indigenous populations. Does that affect their trust in science or their behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. And we had on our expert panel Indigenous representation, which was really key. And yeah, we did learn that, yes, of course. And thank you for this question, Sabrina. These historical factors, government malfeasance, et cetera, over time, have deeply contributed to distrust in these institutions in a very meaningful way that we should understand. But that's why that community is so important. What we learned was that you can't, again, it's not an eat your peas approach. It's not a top-down approach. We can't go, and parachute into Indigenous communities and say you should get vaccinated. What we need to do is work with those communities to understand the hesitancy and then bring community leaders on board to help us with that message. And there are, in every community, there are community leaders who are very interested in evidence-based information. So it's about finding those people and not, trying to be the be-all end-all yourself as the messenger, but instead working, in community, both on the content of the message, but also allowing the communities to deliver that message.
Nick,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to echo Jagris's last point. I think that's so key. We had a big experiment sort of highlighting the importance of trusted messengers, especially, this is a problem for all institutions, but maybe most of all for the federal government. Exactly like Jagris said, you cannot try to be or even presume to be the best deliverer of scientific evidence or recommendations to all the many different types of communities around the country, whether they be Indigenous people or whether they be communities defined even by non-demographic factors, like where they get their information or what platforms they use. You sort of need to find trusted messengers for communities all the time. And I would just add finally that in many of our surveys, we oversample Indigenous peoples, because even if we do census matching and try to get a nationally representative sample, at the numbers we're working with, we might not have enough people from certain groups to make robust claims. So we'll intentionally collect more data there. It's a super complex topic. Different communities are being underserved in different ways. One that I've been thinking about a lot is how we've looked at how misinformation, not just COVID, but also climate-related misinformation, immigration-related misinformation, can turn into actual online harms and hate and abuse. And we know that certain communities, Indigenous peoples being one of them, experience online hate and abuse, misinformation related or not, at rates far higher than the rest of the country. So there are ongoing problems, not just historical problems. And I think remedying some of these problems could go a long way to earning more trust.
Yeah, just to echo what Jagris was saying, at Science at First, this first study that we did was of a representative national sample. So as Nick was saying, we do and hope to get the funding to go back and have these dialogues with Indigenous communities across Canada to get a real understanding from the communities, what it is that they need from trusted sources and how we can work together. But just to echo what Jagris was saying, when Science at First works with communities, with Indigenous communities or South Asian communities or Black communities, it is a community-led question as opposed to a Science at First led solution. So we work to ask from the community what it is that they need from us, and if there are tools that we can share, or we're learning as much about the community needs when we work together with communities. So it really is a listening that we all need to be doing right now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I see Leigh Pulsith is in the audience. Long time no see. And Leigh asks, I'm wondering about how science communicators are quote, unbiased and quote, authentic. Magda mentioned both of these things as being key, and I continue to struggle with this idea that science can be completely devoid of biases. It's such a complex issue, and communicating it to the public poses some really big hurdles too. This flows into the idea of trust also. So I suppose that one's directed to you, Magda. So I don't know if you'd care to share about the idea that, science, we aim to be unbiased. Is it really truly possible for science or science communicators to be unbiased when they're sharing information about vaccines or climate change or what have you?
I think as science communicators, we do our best to communicate what the research says. And you're right, Leigh, there's biases threaded through everything, but the best that we can do is to say, here's the research, let me help you understand what this research is saying. And then as things change and as things move, we change the messaging to reflect what the most accurate science is. So I don't think I have an answer to whether we can be totally unbiased. It's a human, there's human elements that are put into communication as well. But the best that we can do is to really work with the science that we have, the good peer-reviewed data.
And I'll just add to that briefly. I think, though science is not devoid of bias, some of this training that Magda and Nicholas were talking about in the process of science, I think will help with that hurdle you're talking about, Leigh, which is, this complex issue that science is never completely devoid of bias, but we're doing our best. I think understanding more about that process amongst the public, that scientific literacy, I think would really go a long way to show that, we're not devoid of bias. Here's how we reduce it. And here's how we're working with the best available data. And here's how when science contradicts itself, it's not because, we were trying to pull one over on the public, but because we learned something new. And isn't learning something new a wonderful thing?
Yeah, and I think both of those points are great. And I would just add again the importance of transparency, but also communicating uncertainty is something that I've been thinking about a lot as a way to reduce bias and reduce perceptions of bias. It's true that everything is political, everything is biased on some level, one way or another. But I think scientists, especially in the public health space, just based on some papers I've read, this is not my own group's research, but there's some evidence that communicating uncertainty about pandemics, about vaccines, wherever that uncertainty exists, is really critical. And you might, fewer might choose to get a vaccine at that time, but you'll have earned trust in the long run. Because like Magda's been saying, you have to play a long game, I think, as a science communicator. You can't try to persuade someone on one topic today. You need to show them that you're going to communicate uncertainty when you are uncertain. And you're going to communicate your bias when you are seeing your own bias, and that'll, once again, earn trust compared to people who are not prepared to communicate their uncertainty or their bias.
I'm really curious about the degree to which, this is represented in sort of the recipe that you've put together, Magda, or even some of the strategies for reaching out to the social media people or the conspiracy folks. When as science communicators, when we talk about something like the risks of getting a COVID-19 vaccine, because they are non-zero, to what degree are you encouraging other science communicators to talk about those risks? Is that part of what we mean when we see being transparent? Is that the kind of thing that builds trust, or does it do more harm than good? What's the sense we have about that?
To that specific point, when we were creating content about the COVID vaccines, when they were first coming out, specifically around vaccines for kids, we don't hide the fact that there is a 10% risk or whatever the percentage was. However, we also represented that here is the risk of long COVID, here's the risk of, you know, severe illness, hospitalization. And this is all in that spirit of, I trust you as an audience to look at the information. I don't need to hide the information from you because I want to be your trusted source, but I'm going to give you the whole information. So yes, 10% risk or whatever the risk was. And yes, here are the other risks. And so you need to weigh and make that decision for yourself with the right information in place.
And so perhaps that's some of that that bias that Lee is referring to, is that, you know, we say as science communicators, we advocate you should get vaccinated. That's our bias. We believe that's the best course of action. But here's why: 10% risk if you get vaccinated that you might become ill. But here are all of the risks if you don't get vaccinated. And so being transparent about it, this is how we came to that recommendation. That's how we came to this calculation. That it feels like we're starting to integrate some of those recommendations, which is really exciting. Jagris, I saw you unmuted. I'm not sure. I hope I didn't interrupt. Please go ahead.
No, I just want to add to that because I think we can close the loop actually a bit on Sabrina's earlier question as well. Because if we take that same message, so say there's 10% risk of, you know, adverse effects versus the risk of long COVID versus the risk of, you know, Miss C or whatever. And if that message is not delivered by, you know, Jagris or Nicholas or Magda, but is delivered by a person's family doctor, then the chances of having a good outcome then goes way up yet again. And this isn't from our report, but this is solidly in the literature on vaccine hesitancy. So again, if we can embed those messages in community, and this may take, you know, like some attention paid, say to the medical system, for example, to make sure everybody does have a family doctor who they trust, right? But if we can find those key relationships and then have those risk messages in conversation with people who we do trust on medical matters, for example, then suddenly it's, I think, an easier conversation to have, and people do then, they tend towards making, you know, a better decision in those cases.
Wonderful. So I want to pick up on that. It seems like it would be quite an effective strategy, in particular if you're in person. I'm wondering about some of the media literacy tips. I know we had to jump past them a little bit when we were chatting earlier, Nick. Are there just some brief media literacy tips that you would recommend for people as science communicators, as organizations, you know, engaging with the public? You mentioned that there were, if you provide a prompt to people just before they are looking at different kinds of information online, they're more likely to be accuracy focused in the kinds of content they consume and accuracy focused in terms of what they share. Are there other tips or that you'd recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's all kinds of incredible digital media literacy campaigns that are out there right now. The tips we used were designed to be extremely minimal because we wanted this to be a scalable, in theory, a scalable intervention where you just give someone like a quick dose, a little reminder about digital media literacy. We adapted the tips actually from an international campaign that Facebook developed, ironically, but in collaboration with a nonprofit called First Draft, who works on misinformation. And they were pretty generic. They were things like, check the source of information. Don't just react to the content. Look at the source. You know, look for emotional language or like outrage-inducing language, things like that. I will say that we've really tried to evolve our research on literacies, and one key takeaway that I find fascinating is that when we measure all sorts of literacies that people talk about, news media literacy, digital literacy, science literacy, algorithmic literacy. So just knowing that there is such a thing as a social media algorithm that makes what you see different from what I see, which, by the way, 1/3 of people are wrong about or don't know, despite almost everybody using social media. We find that and we ask how they predict resistance to misinformation, we found, maybe surprisingly, that science literacy and media literacy, which people talk about a lot, were not the most important factors. Rather, it was digital literacy and algorithmic literacy. It was really these literacies about like being able to navigate this modern online information ecosystem that we live in. These were far and away statistically the most strongly related to resistance against misinformation. And I think we need to pay more attention to that. We all do. Not just teaching people about science, but teaching people about like, this is the water you're swimming in. This is how information moves online these days. You might see 100 people doubting vaccines today on your Twitter feed, but they might have been recommended to you and they might not be representative of the population at large. So yeah.
That's that really dovetails with my own research as well. I mean, something like 75%, this is Chris Bale's research at out of Duke, I think. 75% of all of the information shared on Twitter, political information shared on Twitter, is shared by 6% of its user base. And surprise, surprise, it's the most polarized proportion of the user base that's sharing that information. And so this notion that, you know, understanding the water that we swim in, it really does seem like we all could do with some swimming lessons. It could be a really powerful intervention. I am curious, with a group like this convened, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for organizations, for academia, for science communication outfits? What are the biggest opportunities that this research helps us unearth and that you're most excited about getting to see implemented, put into practice, and taking advantage of to, you know, at least give us some water wings?
I guess I'll start. I think it all lends credence to this idea that we truly cannot do top-down communication anymore, right? You know, Anthony, you're with the CBC, and you know, when we were all growing up, we just turn on the CBC, we watch the nature of things, and we're like, yeah, that's science, right? But now the CBC is one of so many different voices that is trying to tell us what is true. And in this media environment, you can't do top down because you're not broadcasting in the same way, right? It's like we're all kind of micro broadcasters now. And so that is why it is so important, you know, if governments want to communicate with the public, that they let go of that need to control the message. And I think the same thing goes for, you know, even maybe our public broadcaster as well, right? It feels safe to control the message, but that's obviously not resonating with people.
I love that, Dragos. I think it speaks to what CASC and Science Up First are doing, in that the message we want to reach as many individuals with good, clear, correct, science-backed information as we possibly can. And we definitely can't do that on our own. So it really is dependent on building that network, that fabric across Canada of science communicators, so that, you know, we work with the Canadian Medical Association to provide physicians with really clear, concise communication snippets, so they don't have to create it, but they can use it for their audience. We work with, you know, Genome Canada, or we work with the CASC members across Canada to, again, tell us what is it that's affecting their local populations. How can we connect with those populations? How can we support each other? It really is, this whole idea of being together against misinformation is so key, because as a micro communicator, because even if you have 1 million people, you're still micro, you know, like you still need this message coming from multiple sources to reach individuals. So the findings both in the fault lines report and your report, Nick, like I'm so excited to, after this conversation, be able to say, okay, so how do we put in that little caveat, you know, like, do you want to share, or how do we educate people about the pool that we're swimming in, both, you know, what it is on like media literacy that we need to know, as well as science literacy. there's so many things that we can do together, and I think we need to do them together.
And Nick, from a governmental perspective, what are the things that let's say I was to crown you prime minister, I was to make you prime minister tomorrow, and you got to set the sort of agenda for the government and say this is what we're going to be focusing on. What do you think we ought to be aiming at?
Yeah, what a great and scary question. Let me begin by dodging it entirely and saying that I won't and can't speak on behalf of the government, but I'll tell you just personally as a guy, not on behalf of the Canadian government, what I am excited about or what I'm hopeful for. I think I really think academics, nonprofits, governments need to join forces more. I think, as we've seen today, there's so many people doing incredible and complementary work on this, but it is still sort of more siloed than it needs to be. And I think there can be more, I don't know what the word is, exponential effects of all this great work if we join forces rather than each person sort of each group organization only talking to their own audience. And I would say, yeah, more concretely, I would go back to what I said earlier. And I think institutions of science, of government, academics, I think really need to find a way to bring people into the scientific process more, proactively build trust through transparency, which comes with some vulnerability, but I think it's key. And, you know, there are ideas like citizen science or participatory research where people actually generate evidence. When it comes to pandemics, what people are seeing and doing on the ground is actually key data that could be feeding into national bottom-up scientific efforts. And I think we need to find ways to, yeah, bring people in, be transparent, and do this proactively before the next pandemic, if I can end on a very sour, spooky note, because it's not, you know, there may be another pandemic. And I think we need to think about this not as like something terrible that happened to us, but a revelation about what needs to change so that it will be better next time.
Well, I, for one, am very optimistic with a group like the three of you all together, that those kinds of conversations can happen, that the kind of collective action to pull in the same, making sure that we're pulling in the same direction can happen. And for people interested in doing just that, they can certainly feel free to reach out to each of you. I know we'll have a title card up in a moment that'll have your email addresses. So just go ahead and spam them with your thoughts and ideas and reach out, because we really do want those kinds of collaborations. It does seem like it's key going forward. That's going to bring us to the end of our panel. There's another feedback poll that we'll be launching. And that's the goal there is to help make future improvements. The CSPC, it really is quite valuable data. The CSPC really does actually use this kind of information. So please do complete that. I'd like to thank once again our panelists for joining. Magda, Jagris, Nick, you've been wonderful to spend time with. I second that heart, Nick. I feel the same thing. And I hope that it's been valuable for our audience today. And I really look forward to seeing what the future of these collaborations will look like. So thank you everyone for being here. Enjoy the rest of the Canadian Science Policy Conference. Hopefully you're going to be there in person. And if not, then feel free to tune into more of these online sessions. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. And I guess we just get to hang out like the Brady Bunch while the cards are up so they can get our emails. Yeah, this has been it's been really